I present this reading and philosophical analysis using the full text of the Red Tower, under the allowances of commentary, criticism, transformation, and non-competition under fair use. This video is not a replacement for the Red Tower. Please consider purchasing from Ligotti's body of work to support him. Here also is a statement from John Paget about the allowability of Ligotti YouTube narration. In a moment, I will narrate the Red Tower. Following this, I will provide my analysis of the story. If you've already read it, you can skip to the analysis chapter marker I provided. However, I would encourage you to listen again, or give it a reread on your own, if it has been a while. Otherwise, turn the lights off, put your headphones in, and relax. Here is Thomas Ligotti's The Red Tower. The ruined factory stood 3 stories high in an otherwise featureless landscape. Although somewhat imposing on its own terms, it occupied only the most unobtrusive place within the grey emptiness of its surroundings, its presence serving as a mere accent upon a desolate horizon. No road led to the factory, nor were there any traces of one that might have led to it at some time in the distant past. If there had ever been such a road, it would have been rendered useless as soon as it arrived at one of the 4 red-bricked sides of the factory, even in the days when the facility was in full operation. The reason for this was simple. No doors had been built into the factory. No loading docks or entryways allowed penetration of the outer walls of the structure, which was solid brick on all 4 sides, without even a single window below the level of the 2nd floor. The phenomenon of a large factory so closed off from the outside world was a point of extreme fascination to me. It was almost with regret that I ultimately learned about the factory's subterranean access. But, of course, that revelation in its turn also became a source for my truly degenerate sense of amazement, my decayed fascination. The factory had long been in ruins, its innumerable bricks worn and crumbling, its many windows shattered. Each of the 3 enormous stories that stood above the ground level was vacant of all but dust and silence. The machinery, which had densely occupied the 3 floors of the factory, as well as considerable space beneath it, is said to have evaporated, I repeat, evaporated, soon after the factory ceased operation, leaving behind only a few spectral outlines of deep vats and tanks, twisting tubes and funnels, harshly grinding gears and levers, giant belts and wheels that could be most clearly seen at twilight, and later not at all. According to these strictly hallucinatory accounts, the whole of the Red Tower, as the factory was known, had always been subject to fadings at certain times. This phenomenon, in the delirious or dying words of several witnesses, was due to a profound hostility between the noisy and malodorous operations of the factory and the desolate purity of the landscape surrounding it. The conflict occasionally resulting in temporary erasures or fadings of the former by the latter. Despite their ostensibly mad or credulous origins, these testimonies, it seemed to me, deserved more than a cursory hearing. The legendary conflict between the factory and the grayish territory surrounding it may very well have been a fabrication of individuals who were lost in the advanced stages of either physical or psychic deterioration. Nonetheless, it was my theory, and remains so, that the Red Tower was not always that peculiar color for which it ultimately earned its fame. Thus, the encrimsoning of the factory was a betrayal, a breaking off, for it is my postulation that this ancient structure was in long forgotten days the same pale hue as the world which encompassed it. Furthermore, with an insight born of dispassion to the point of total despair, I envisioned that the Red Tower was never solely devoted to the lowly functions of an ordinary factory. Beneath the 3 soaring stories of the Red Tower were 2, possibly 3, other levels. The one immediately below the 1st floor of the factory was the nexus of a unique distribution system for the goods which were manufactured on all 3 of the floors above. This first subterranean level in many ways resembled, and functioned in the manner of, an old-fashioned underground mine. Elevator compartments enclosed by a heavy wire mesh, twisted and corroded, descended far below the surface into an expansive chamber which had been crudely dug out of the rocky earth, and was haphazardly perpetuated by a dense structure of supports, a crisscrossing network of posts and pillars, beams and rafters, that included a variety of materials: wood, metal, concrete, bone, and a fine, sinewy webbing that was fibrous and quite firm. From this central chamber radiated a system of tunnels that honeycombed the land beneath the gray and desolate country surrounding the Red Tower. Through these tunnels, the goods manufactured by the factory could be carried, sometimes literally by hand, but more often by means of small wagons and carts, reaching near and far into the most obscure and unlikely delivery points. The trade that was originally produced by the Red Tower was in some sense remarkable, but not at first of an extraordinary or especially ambitious nature. These were a gruesome array of goods that could perhaps best be described as novelty items. In the beginning, there was a chaotic quality to the objects and constructions produced by the machinery at the Red Tower, a randomness that yielded formless things of no consistent shape or size or apparent design. Occasionally, there might appear a peculiar ashen lump that betrayed some semblance of a face, or clawing fingers, or perhaps an assemblage that looked like a casket with tiny irregular wheels. But for the most part, the early productions seemed relatively innocuous. After a time, however, things began to fall into place, as they always do, rejecting a harmless and uninteresting disorder, never an enduring state of affairs, and taking on the more usual plans and purposes of a viciously intent creation. So it was that the Red Tower put into production its new, more terrible and perplexing line of unique novelty items. Among the objects and constructions now manufactured were several of an almost innocent nature. These included tiny, delicate cameos that were heavier than their size would suggest, far heavier, and lockets whose shiny outer surface flipped open to reveal a black, reverberant abyss inside, a deep blackness roaring with echoes. Along the same lines was a series of lifelike replicas of internal organs and physiological structures, many of them evidencing an advanced stage of disease, and all of them displeasingly warm and soft to the touch. There was a fake, disembodied hand on which fingernails would grow several inches overnight, and insistently grew back should one attempt to clip them. Numerous natural objects, mostly bulbous gourds, were designed to produce a long, deafening scream whenever they were picked up, or otherwise disturbed in their vegetable stillness. Less scrutable were things such as hardened globs of lava, into whose rough, igneous forms were set a pair of rheumy eyes that perpetually shifted their gaze from side to side like a relentless pendulum. And there was also a humble piece of cement, a fragment broken away from any street or sidewalk, that left a most intractable stain, greasy and green, on whatever surface it was placed. But such fairly simple items were eventually followed and ultimately replaced by more articulated objects and constructions. One example of this complex type of novelty item was an ornate music box that, when opened, emitted a brief gurgling or suckling sound in emulation of a dying individual's death rattle. Another product manufactured in great quantity at the Red Tower was a pocket watch in a gold casing, which opened to reveal a curious timepiece whose numerals were represented by tiny, quivering insects, while the circling hands were reptilian tongues, slender and pink. But these examples hardly begin to hint at the range of goods that came from the factory during its novelty phase of production. I should at least mention the exotic carpets woven with intricate abstract patterns that, when focused upon for a certain length of time, composed themselves into fleeting, phantasmagoric scenes of a kind which might pass through a fever-stricken or even permanently damaged brain. As it was revealed to me, and as I have already revealed to you, the means of distributing the novelty goods fabricated at the Red Tower was a system of tunnels, located on the first level, not the second, or possibly third, that had been excavated below the 3-story factory building itself. It seems that these subterranean levels were not necessarily the foundation of the original plan of the factory, but were in fact a perverse and unlikely development that might have occurred only as the structure known as the Red Tower underwent, over time, its own mutation from some prior state until it finally became a lowly site for manufacturing. This mutation apparently demanded the excavation, whether from above or below I cannot say, of a system of tunnels as a means for distributing the novelty goods which, for a time, the factory produced. As the unique inventions of the Red Tower achieved their final forms, they seemed to be assigned specific locations to which they were destined to be delivered, either by hand or by small wagons or carts, pulled over sometimes great distances through the system of underground tunnels. Where they might ultimately pop up was anybody's guess. It might be in the back of a dark closet, buried under a pile of undistinguished junk, where some item of the highest and most extreme novelty would lie for quite some time before it was encountered by sheer accident or misfortune. Conversely, the same invention, or an entirely different one, might be placed on the night table beside someone's bed for near immediate discovery. Any delivery point was possible. None was out of the reach of the Red Tower. There has even been testimony, either intensely hysterical or semi-conscious, of items from the factory being uncovered within the shelter of a living body, or one not long deceased. I know that such an achievement was within the factory's powers, given its later production history. But my own degenerate imagination is most fully captured by the thought of how many of these monstrous novelty goods produced at the Red Tower had been scrupulously and devoutly delivered, solely by way of those endless underground tunnels, to daringly remote places where they would never be found, nor ever could be. Truly, the Red Tower worked in mysterious ways. Just as a system of distribution tunnels had been created by the factory when it developed into a manufacturer of novelty goods, an expansion of this system was required as an entirely new phase of production gradually evolved. Inside the wire mesh elevator compartment that provided access between the upper region of the factory and the underground tunnels, there was now a special lever installed which, when pulled back, or possibly pushed forward, I do not know such details, enabled one to descend to a second subterranean level. This laterally excavated area was much smaller, far more intimate than the one directly above it, as could be observed the instant the elevator compartment came to a stop, and a full view of things was attained. The scene which now confronted the uncertain minds of witnesses was in many ways like that of a secluded graveyard, surrounded by a rather crooked fence of widely spaced pickets held together by rusty wire. The headstones inside the fence all closely pressed against one another, and were quite common, though somewhat antiquated in their design. However, there were no names or dates inscribed on these monuments. Nothing at all, in fact, with the exception of some rudimentary and abstract ornamentation. This could be verified only when the subterranean graveyard was closely approached, for the lighting at this level was dim and unorthodox, provided exclusively by the glowing stone walls enclosing the area. These walls seemed to have been covered with phosphorescent paint, which bathed the graveyard in a cloudy, grayish haze. For the longest time, how long I cannot say, my morbid reveries were focused on this murky vision of a graveyard beneath the factory. A subterranean graveyard, surrounded by a crooked picket fence, and suffused by the highly defective illumination given off by phosphorescent paint applied to stone walls. For the moment, I must emphasize the vision itself, without any consideration paid to the utilitarian purposes of this place, that is, the function it served in relation to the factory above it. The truth is that at some point all of the factory's functions were driven underground to this graveyard level, long before the complete evaporation of machinery in the Red Tower. Something happened to require the shutdown of all operations in the 3 floors of the factory which were above ground level. The reasons for this action are deeply obscure, a matter of contemplation only when a state of hopeless and devouring curiosity has reached its height, when the burning light of speculation becomes so intense that it threatens to incinerate everything on which it shines. To my own mind, it seems entirely valid to reiterate at this juncture the long-standing tensions that existed between the Red Tower, which I believe was not always stigmatized by such a hue and such a title, and the grayish landscape of utter desolation that surrounded this structure on all sides, looming around and above it for quite incalculable distances. But below the ground level of the factory was another matter. It was here that its operations at some point retreated. It was here, specifically at the graveyard level, that they continued. Clearly, the Red Tower had committed some violation or offense. its clamoring activities and unorthodox products, perhaps its very existence, constituting an affront to the changeless quietude of the world around it. In my personal judgment, there had been a betrayal involved, a treacherous breaking of a bond. I can certainly picture a time before the existence of the factory, before any of its features blemished the featureless country that extended so gray and so desolate on every side. Dreaming upon the grayish desolation of that landscape, I also find it quite easy to imagine that there might have occurred a lapse in the monumental tedium, a spontaneous and inexplicable impulse to deviate from a dreary perfection. Perhaps even an unconquerable desire to risk a move toward attempting defectiveness. As a concession to this impulse or desire, out of nowhere, as a minimal surrender, a creation took place, and a structure took form where there had been nothing of its kind before. I picture it, at its inception, as a barely discernible eruption in the landscape, a mere sketch of an edifice, possibly translucent when making its first appearance, a gray density rising in the grayness, embossed upon it in a most tasteful and harmonious design. But such structures or creations have their own desires, their own destinies to fulfill, their own mysteries and mechanisms which they must follow at whatever risk. From a gray and desolate and utterly featureless landscape, a dull edifice had been produced, a pale, possibly translucent tower which over time began to develop into a factory and to issue, as if in the spirit of the most grotesque belligerence, a line of quite morbid, quite wonderfully disgusting novelty goods. In an expression of defiance, at some point, it reddened with an enigmatic passion for betrayal and perversity. On the surface, the red tower might have seemed a splendid complement to the grayish desolation of its surroundings, a unique, picturesque composition that served to define the glorious essence of each of them. But in fact, there existed between them a profound and ineffable hostility. An attempt was made to reclaim the Red Tower, or, at least, to draw it back toward the formless origins of its being. I am referring, of course, to that show of force which resulted in the evaporation of the factory's dense arsenal of machinery. Each of the 3 stories of the Red Tower had been cleaned out, purged of its offending means of manufacturing novelty items, and the part of the factory that rose above the ground was left to fall into ruins. Had the machinery in the Red Tower not been evaporated, I believe that the subterranean graveyard, or something very much like it, would nonetheless have come into existence at some point or another. This was the direction in which the factory had been moving, a fact suggested by some of its later models of novelty items. Machines were becoming obsolete as the diseased mania of the Red Tower intensified and evolved into more experimental, even visionary projects. I have previously reported that the headstones in the factory's subterranean graveyard were absent of any names of the interred, and were without dates of birth and death. This truth has been confirmed by numerous accounts rendered in borderline gibberish. The reason for these blank headstones is entirely evident as one gazes upon them, standing crooked and closely packed together in the phosphorescent haze given off by the stone walls covered with luminous paint. None of these graves, in point of fact, could be said to have anyone buried in them whose names and dates of birth and death would require inscription on the headstones. These were not what might be called burying graves. This is to say that these were in no sense graves for burying the dead. Quite the contrary, these were graves of a highly experimental design from which the newest productions of the Red Tower were to be born. From its beginnings as a manufacturer of novelty items of an extravagant nature, the factory had now gone into the business of creating what came to be known as hyper-organisms. These new productions were also of a fundamentally extreme nature, representing an even greater divergence on the part of the Red Tower from the bland and gray desolation in the midst of which it stood. As implied by their designation as hyper-organisms, this line of goods displayed the most essential qualities of their organic nature, which meant, of course, that they were wildly conflicted in their 2 basic features. On the one hand, they manifested an intense vitality in all aspects of their form and function. On the other hand, and simultaneously, they manifested an ineluctable element of decay in these same areas. To state this matter in the most lucid terms, each of these hyperorganisms, even as they scintillated with an obscene degree of vital impulses, also, and at the same time, had degeneracy and death written deeply upon them. In accord with the tradition of dumbstruck insanity, it seems the less said about these offspring of the birthing graves, or any similar creations, the better. I myself have been almost entirely restricted to a state of seething speculation concerning the luscious particularities of all hyperorganic phenomena produced in the subterranean graveyard of the Red Tower. Although we may reasonably assume that such creations were not to be called beautiful, we cannot know for ourselves the mysteries and mechanisms of, for instance, how these creations moved throughout the hazy luminescence of that underground world, what creaky or spasmic gestures they might have been capable of executing, if any, what sounds they might have made or the organs used for making them, how they might have appeared when awkwardly emerging from deep shadows, or squatting against those nameless headstones, what trembling stages of mutation they almost certainly would have undergone, following the generation of their larvae upon the barren earth of the graveyard, what their bodies might have produced or emitted in the way of fluids and secretions, how they might have responded to the mutilation of their forms for reasons of an experimental or entirely savage nature. Often I picture to myself what frantically clawing efforts these creations probably made to deliver themselves from that confining environment which their malformed or non-existent brains could not begin to understand. They could not have comprehended, any more than can I, for what purpose they were bred from those graves, those incubators of hyperorganisms, minute factories of flesh that existed wholly within and far below the greater factory of the Red Tower. It was no surprise, of course, that the production of hyperorganisms was not allowed to continue for very long before a second wave of destruction was visited upon the factory. This time, it was not merely the fading and ultimate evaporation of machinery that took place. This time, it was something far more brutal. Once again, forces of ruination were directed at the factory, specifically the subterranean graveyard, located at its second underground level, its 3-story structure that stood above ground having already been rendered an echoing ruin. Information on what remained of the graveyard and of its cleverly blasphemous works is available to my own awareness only in the form of shuddering and badly garbled whispers of mayhem and devastation and wholesale sundering of the most unspeakable sort. These same sources also seem to regard this incident as the culmination, if not the conclusion, of the long-standing hostilities between the Red Tower and that grayish halo of desolation that hovered around it on all sides. Such a shattering episode would appear to have terminated the career of the Red Tower. Nevertheless, there are indications that, appearances to the contrary, the factory continues to be active despite its status as a silent ruin. After all, the evaporation of the machinery which turned out countless novelty items in the 3-story red brick factory proper and the ensuing obsolescence of its sophisticated system of tunnels at the first underground level did not prevent the factory from pursuing its business by other and more devious means. The work at the second underground level, the graveyard level, went very well for a time. Following the vicious decimation of those ingenious and fertile graves, along with the merchandise they produced, it may have seemed that the manufacturing history of the Red Tower had been brought to a close. Yet there are indications that below the 3-story above-ground factory, below the first and second underground levels, there exists a third level of subterranean activity. Perhaps it is only a desire for symmetry, a hunger for compositional balance in things, that has led to a series of the most vaporous rumors anent this third underground level, in order to provide a kind of complementary proportion to the 3 stories of the factory that rise into the gray and featureless landscape above ground. At this third level, these rumors maintain, the factory's schedule of production is being carried out in some new and strange manner, representing its most ambitious venture in the output of putrid creations, ultimately consummating its tradition of degeneracy, reaching toward a perfection of defect and disorder, according to every polluted and foggy rumor concerned with this issue. Perhaps it seems that I have said too much about the Red Tower, and perhaps it has sounded far too strange. Do not think that I am unaware of such things. But as I have noted throughout this document, I am only repeating what I have heard. I myself have never seen the Red Tower, no one ever has, and possibly no one ever will. And yet, wherever I go, people are talking about it. In one way or another, they are talking about the nightmarish novelty items, or about the mysterious and revolting hyperorganisms, as well as babbling endlessly about the subterranean system of tunnels, and the secluded graveyard whose headstones display no names and no dates, designating either birth or death. Everything they are saying is about the Red Tower, in one way or another, and about nothing else but the Red Tower. We are all talking and thinking about the Red Tower in our own degenerate way. I have only recorded what everyone is saying, though they may not know they are saying it, and sometimes what they have seen, though they may not know they have seen it. But still, they are always talking, in one deranged way or another, about the Red Tower. I hear them talk of it every day of my life, unless, of course, they begin to speak about the grey and desolate landscape, that hazy void in which the Red Tower, the great and industrious Red Tower, is so precariously nestled. Then the voices grow quiet, until I can barely hear them as they attempt to communicate with me in choking scraps of post-nightmare trauma. Now is just such a time when I must strain to hear the voices. I wait for them to reveal to me the new ventures of the Red Tower, as it proceeds into even more corrupt phases of production, including the creations being turned out by the shadowy workshop of its third subterranean level. I must keep still and listen for the voices. I must remain quiet for a terrifying moment. Then I will hear the news of the factory starting up its operations once more. Then I will be able to speak again of the Red Tower. The Red Tower is my favorite of Ligotti's short fiction, and it's not even strictly due to what I think are its fascinating philosophical underpinnings. You may have, like I did at first, gotten to the end of the Red Tower and thought, that was cool, but may have been slightly disappointed at the seeming lack of plot or clear meaning. I already saw what I thought were philosophical consequences to be drawn from the imagery, but still, the feeling remained. Once I let the story sit with me for a few hours, though, I became comfortable with accepting the story as an imagery-filled jaunt. Ligotti is writing at an unparalleled level here, conjuring surreal and bizarre nightmares with ease. The Red Tower is so strong because it seems to reach across different senses and mediums. You can hear the wet squelching of flesh and clank of machinery, smell the rotten grease, taste the dust and dank air. The closest experience I've had to reading The Red Tower is watching the David Lynch movie Eraserhead. They both blast you with liminal, dreamlike imagery that erodes the ground away from beneath your feet. These works infect your mind more totally than anything that's more conventional. So, The Red Tower is fascinating to read on its own because of its imagistic power. Clearly, I also saw explicit relations to what I knew were Ligotti's philosophical views. This is my attempt to draw out and make those connections explicit. However, while I do think Ligotti's intent was likely to make the Red Tower a kind of painting of his views, I can't say that my analysis is correct. And there are elements of the story that seem to defy a clear or direct meaning under my own lens. So this is my interpretation, and it is incomplete. I will be mainly working with Peter Wessel Zapffel's The Last Messiah, Ligotti's main philosophical influence, with occasional references to Ligotti's own philosophical work, The Conspiracy Against the Human Race. If you have any other interpretations, disagree with how I read something, or want to build on what I say, anything at all, please comment your thoughts below. I absolutely love the discussions in the comments. Also, if you enjoy videos on philosophical analysis and dark fiction, I humbly request a subscription to my channel because I truly think it will be worth your time. I always strive to bring the best, most stimulating content that I am capable of to my viewers. With that said, here is my analysis. I read The Red Tower as a visual representation of Ligotti's Zapffian views. In Zapffel's The Last Messiah, mankind is presented as a kind of organic, biological paradox. Humanity came from life, from nature, but ended up being too different and self-negating. A break in the very unity of life, a biological paradox, a monstrosity and absurdity, a hypertrophy of the most catastrophic kind. In spite of its new eyes, mankind still had its roots in base matter. Its soul was woven into matter and subject to its blind laws. The reason for this difference is humanity's consciousness. our ability to scrutinize and question. We look for meaning, for answers, but the universe falls short every time. It has no answers and no meaning. We, through our self-consciousness, are imbued with the need for meaning and purpose, but are denied it because no such thing exists. He is powerful in his world, but he curses his power because he has bought it with his soul's harmony, his innocence, his comfort in life's embrace. He stands there with his visions, betrayed by the universe, in bewilderment and angst. In the story, Ligotti uses the Red Tower as a symbol for mankind and self-consciousness, and the surrounding wasteland as a symbol for nature or life. Other than the Red Tower, the landscape is gray and largely undifferentiated. The Red Tower exists as a break in unity, an obtrusive bleeding wound that blots the otherwise pure vista. The ruined factory stood 3 stories high in an otherwise featureless landscape. Although somewhat imposing on its own terms, it occupied only the most unobtrusive place within the gray emptiness of its surroundings, its presence serving as a mere accent upon a desolate horizon. The narrator of the story speculates that the Red Tower was not always that peculiar color for which it ultimately earned its fame, for it is my postulation that this ancient structure was in long forgotten days the same pale hue as the world which encompassed it. As a concession to this impulse or desire out of nowhere, as a minimal surrender, a creation took place, and a structure took form where there had been nothing of its kind before. I picture it, at its inception, as a barely discernible eruption in the landscape, a mere sketch of an edifice, possibly translucent when making its first appearance, a gray density rising in the grayness, embossed upon it in a most tasteful and harmonious design. But such structures or creations have their own desires, their own destinies to fulfill, their own mysteries and mechanisms, which they must follow at whatever risk. Mankind was not always equipped with our burdensome consciousness. We once were beasts, and our intelligence slowly evolved to the point of weariness. Zapffe says, nature had aimed too high and outdone itself. A species had been too heavily armed. Its genius made it not only omnipotent over the outer world, but equally dangerous for itself. To make this a bit more concrete, mankind can suffer, and we can suffer about the fact that we suffer. We feel anxiety, we feel the meaninglessness of our lives, we know our death lies inevitably on the horizon. We know we are not in full control over our thoughts and feelings. When one is depressed and anxious, the human mind is like such antlers, which, in all their magnificent glory, crush their bearer slowly to the ground. Zapffe here uses the image of a deer with antlers that grow too large. In its initial form, antlers provided a necessary evolutionary role for survival, but through random chance, they developed into a burdensome, obtrusive crown rather than an asset. Our too powerful and insatiable minds also come with wearisome side effects. Zapffe sees this as a pseudo-betrayal of nature. We can never feel at home in the universe again, a difference that, through random chance, forever sets us apart from the unreflective unity of being. Man has lost his citizenship in the universe. He has eaten from the tree of knowledge and has been banished from paradise. Similarly, the differentiation of the Red Tower, its encrimsoning, is seen as a kind of betrayal. Thus, the encrimsoning of the factory was a betrayal, a breaking off. Clearly, the Red Tower had committed some violation or offense, its clamoring activities and unorthodox products, perhaps its very existence, constituting an affront to the changeless quietude of the world around it. Notice also the Red Tower's impenetrability. Despite being continuous with the surrounding landscape, it is completely closed off. No roads lead to it or out from it. Despite the continuity, the Red Tower admits of no true contact with the outside world. No doors had been built into the factory. No loading docks or entryways allowed penetration of the outer walls of the structure. Self-consciousness is a phenomenon that, as yet, seems completely inscrutable. Despite our best attempts to explain and understand, we have yet to arrive at a theory sufficiently explanatory and sufficiently satisfying. How something like recursive subjective experience and qualia can arise from inert, mindless matter is still something of a mystery. It is as if there are no doors leading into it, no promising avenues to follow in hopes of an answer. But no doors into the Red Tower also means no doors exiting the Red Tower. And this to me signifies that despite our reflective, intelligent, scientific prowess, our consciousness ends with us. Our contact with the outside consists purely of sensory representations. We have no true access to the inn itself, just like the Red Tower has to burrow underground just to get outside of it. While this consciousness analysis doesn't directly appear in Zapffe, Ligotti's work, The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, has a section devoted to Thomas Metzinger, a German philosopher of consciousness who notoriously claims that there is no such thing as an enduring man-in-the-control chair self. Ligotti was clearly influenced by Metzinger, and in Metzinger's book, The Ego Tunnel, he describes this representational system as such. The conscious brain is a biological machine, a reality engine, that purports to tell us what exists and what doesn't. It is unsettling to discover that there are no colors out there in front of your eyes. What is really happening is that the visual system in your brain is drilling a tunnel through this inconceivably rich physical environment, and in the process is painting the tunnel walls in various shades of color. Phenomenal color. Appearance only. First, I have to point out that it's explicitly likened to drilling a tunnel, which the Red Tower uses to make contact with the outside world. Representational, conscious mind in this quote, and the world in itself, are qualitatively different, and neither can fully adequate the other. For all our work, there still seems to be a strict demarcation between them, just like the Red Tower and its desolate surroundings. This reinforces Ligotti's pessimism with a solipsistic angle. So, there's a strife between consciousness and the unconscious, between humanity and the rest of nature, between the Red Tower and the surrounding landscape, and it tends to lead to the former's pain and destruction, likened in Zapffe and Ligotti as a kind of consequence for the fundamental betrayal of difference. From that moment on, he finds himself in a state of chronic pain. Such cosmic panic is basic to every human mind. The species, in this light, seems predestined to destruction, since any effort to preserve and continue life is crippled when one's undivided attention and energy is required to stave off the catastrophic pressure of one's inner being. So it is with the Red Tower. The whole of the Red Tower, as the factory was known, had always been subject to fadings at certain times. This phenomenon, in the delirious or dying words of several witnesses, was due to a profound hostility between the noisy and malodorous operations of the factory and the desolate purity of the landscape surrounding it, the conflict occasionally resulting in temporary erasures or fadings of the former by the latter. The Red Tower is a factory, capable of autonomous production. Its internal makeup is explicitly mechanical. Even after the fadings and evaporations, within the tower can be seen a few spectral outlines of deep vats and tanks, twisting tubes and tunnels, harshly grinding gears and levers, giant belts and wheels. This is another source of Zapffian friction, despite the sense that we are a transcendent subject, a self, a persisting mind. All other evidence seems to point to us being, unfortunately, disastrously conscious meat sacks, conscious puppets, akin to the Metzinger no-self model of subjectivity, where our subjective experience is merely a complicated method of representation for an otherwise completely deterministic system. Even on the bodily level, we can look within ourselves and see our pulsing, fleshy appendages and organs. But at the same time, man could scrutinize matter as though it were a stranger. He could compare himself with other phenomena, uncover and categorize his own vital processes. Soon he sees mechanics behind everything, even behind that which he used to hold dear, his beloved smile. So, just like the Red Tower, we are transparently mechanical. The terror and paralysis one feels when looking at a person you unquestionably love, someone who seems so unique, distinct, autonomous, like they have a soul, and simultaneously knowing they are a deterministic, yet self-conscious biological machine, is the kind of tension-filled horror that epitomizes mankind's paradoxical condition. Reality seems to balk at our power, and make us shameful of it by showing our consistent illusions of superiority and transcendence. Despite our pretensions, we are still natural. Despite the Red Tower's betrayal and differentiation, the attacks from the outside landscape show that the tower is still beholden to its source. So why does the red tower not yield to the landscape? Why does man not yield to our nature? In Zapfe's words, why then was the human race not wiped out long ago in great, raging epidemics of insanity? Why are there so few individuals who succumb to the pressure of life because their acuity reveals to them more than they can bear? Well, most people manage to save themselves by artificially paring down their consciousness. Man saves himself and continues. Ironically, man's survival is made possible by a more or less conscious suppression of his hazardous surplus of consciousness. Mankind retreats from the very heights of its difference in order to lessen the weight of their burdensome awareness. Similarly, besieged by the world around through its betrayal and difference, the red tower retreats underground. It burrows its productive capacities within the natural landscape. Thus, mankind becomes less intelligent and resembles more so the surrounding continuity of nature. The red tower, likewise, makes itself more akin to the landscape by placing its operations therein. Yet this is no alleviating solution. In a way, it exacerbates the paradox. Our consciousness is too much, so we then weaponize our consciousness against our consciousness in a reductive manner. We don't submit to the truth of nature and the inevitability of the clash. We stubbornly persist by choosing self-negation and the denial of truth. When mankind retreats from the knowledge of its horrific, paradoxical condition, it tends to fall into 4 general categories of consciousness limitation. The first, isolation, is described by Zapffe as a completely arbitrary rejection of disturbing and destructive thoughts or feelings. This may seem sensible enough, right? Why feel terrible feelings and think destructive thoughts, even if it's a so-called arbitrary rejection? Zapffe thinks modern talk of mental health seems to agree with that sentiment. Today's psychiatry operates under the assumption that this health and adjustment is the highest goal one can aspire to. Depression, angst, a refusal to eat, and so forth are taken without exception to be marks of a pathological condition and are treated accordingly. The cultural understanding of depressive thoughts and feelings is one that sees them as infectious. Thus, it is perfectly natural, and even good, to fight back these feelings, as one may fight a disease. The first defense mechanism against the truth, then, seems relatively innocuous. So too with the first phase of production from within the red tower. Now, I want to note here that this is the most difficult and unclear portion of the interpretation. The order of the phases of production, the fadings and evaporations within the red tower, these don't seem to fit cleanly into any neat layout. I still think there's interpretive weight and educational weight here, but there is definitely room for alternate views. If any astute viewers have them, feel free to share them in the comments. Just know that the following is a looser mapping, and a bit more speculative in some places. So, this tactic of isolation, being innocuous and arbitrary, is analogous to the first phase of production from the red tower. In the beginning, there was a chaotic quality to the objects and constructions produced by the machinery at the red tower, a randomness that yielded formless things of no consistent shape or size or apparent design, but for the most part, the early productions seemed relatively innocuous. Just like isolation, the first phase of production from the red tower is identified as relatively innocuous and harmless, just like the avoidance of painful thoughts and feelings. Additionally, they are both identified as random or arbitrary. Eventually, the red tower moves underground, at first for distribution and later for full production. As seen in Zapffe, each coping mechanism is seen as paradoxical and almost profane in some sense, a further debasement to an already pathetic organism. So it is with the red tower's defiling underground retreat. It seems that these subterranean levels were not necessarily the foundation of the original plan of the factory, but were in fact a perverse and unlikely development that might have occurred only as the structure known as the red tower underwent, over time, its own mutation from some prior state until it finally became a lowly site for manufacturing. The red tower also initiates its later phases of production, rejecting the more innocuous and random first stage. After a time, however, things began to fall into place, as they always do, rejecting a harmless and uninteresting disorder, never an enduring state of affairs, and taking on the more usual plans and purposes of a viciously intent creation. In The Last Messiah, The second method he outlines is attachment. Like the later production phases, it is more conscious and directed, more intentional. The method of attachment is also at work from early childhood, where parents, home, and neighborhood are taken for granted by the child and give him a sense of security. Attachment can be seen as an attempt to establish fixed points in, or a wall around, the shifting chaos of consciousness. Usually, this is an unconscious process, but sometimes it is quite conscious, as for example in an attempt to set some sort of goal for oneself, some reason to live. Attachment is largely an attempt to root yourself to something stable. As Thomas Ligotti puts it, in order to stabilize our lives in the tempestuous waters of chaos, we conspire to anchor them in metaphysical and institutional verities: God, morality, natural law, country, family, that inebriate us with a sense of being official, authentic, and safe in our beds. While this connection is admittedly tenuous and again speculative, the first of these new phases reflects deep human emotion and connection containing an abyss within them. For Ligotti and Zapffe, love and stability and connection are all intimately connected to this fear of being. There is a void behind their masks because they are all part of this method of attachment. Tiny, delicate cameos that were heavier than their size would suggest, far heavier, and lockets whose shiny outer surface flipped open to reveal a black, reverberant abyss inside, a deep blackness roaring with echoes. These cameos and lockets are symbolizing enduring attachment and stability, to showcase an undying love and connection. But they, just like the method of attachment, are a lie. Beneath the illusion of stability is a gaping emptiness, and their weight and depth betray the fundamental import they hold in the lying for survival. The third method of coping is diversion, another intentional tactic that is characteristic of the Red Tower's later, more intentional phases. With diversion, we keep our field of vision within acceptable bounds by keeping it busy with a ceaseless stream of new impressions. Diversion tactics are often quite conscious. We need to steadily divert our attention from ourselves, because despair can lie just under the surface, in a catch of breath or a sudden sob. The later phases of the Red Tower's production scheme reflect this. The novelty goods here are highly sensory-oriented. They produce sounds, sights, and smells, sometimes upon request of the user. Numerous natural objects, mostly bulbous gourds, were designed to produce a long, deafening scream whenever they were picked up, or otherwise disturbed in their vegetable stillness. Less scrutable were such things as hardened globs of lava, into whose rough, igneous forms were set a pair of rheumy eyes that perpetually shifted their gaze from side to side, like a relentless pendulum. Notice that the eyes going back and forth are compared to a pendulum. This lends them an almost hypnotic quality, similar to diversions, which hypnotize the person out of existential dread. And then there is the novelty good that resembles some kind of TV screen. I should at least mention the exotic carpets, woven with intricate abstract patterns that, when focused upon for a certain length of time, composed themselves into fleeting phantasmagoric scenes, of a kind which might pass through a fever-stricken or even permanently damaged brain. These novelty items are boisterous and command the attention, ensuring that the truth of being goes unacknowledged through diversion. The novelty goods are distributed to their destinations through a series of excavated tunnels. These tunnels, and the central chamber from which they fan out, are haphazardly perpetuated by a dense structure of supports, a crisscrossing network of posts and pillars, beams and rafters that included a variety of materials: wood, metal, concrete, bone, and a fine sinewy webbing that was fibrous and quite firm. These tunnels are generally used to deliver the novelty goods, which symbolize the methods of isolation, attachment, and diversion. Attachment in particular is seen as an attempt to provide stability and support against the crushing weight of being, like the crushing weight of the earth being held off by a precarious structure of beams and pillars. In The Last Messiah, Zapffe directly compares the stability needed to carry out these coping methods two beams and pillars, saying it is built on the solid beams of basic cultural ways of thinking. The common man manages with these shared cultural beams. His personality almost builds itself. The closer a norm lies to the bearing beams, the more dangerous it is to disturb it. Playing these games can unwittingly dig too deep at a weak spot in one's protective walls, and break a hole through into the yawning void. The situation can change in the blink of an eye, from a light-hearted caper to a dance of death. The terror of existence stares us in the face, and we realize with a staggering gasp that our minds hang suspended by a web of their own making, and that the abyss of hell gapes below. Cultural norms and practices, those understandings that inform the basic ways we interpret and judge the world, are the sole structure that allows us to carry out our lives. They tend to function as intended, like the supports under the Red Tower that hold open its excavations for merchandise transport, but are weak and unstable upon closer examination. Removing or damaging the more fundamental ones threatens to overturn the whole artifice, like questioning God, morality, family, and the state. The novelty goods are then delivered to various points, and end up being used and remembered or disremembered in a variety of ways and lengths of time. I tend to see this as merely a commentary on the sheer diversity of manifestations that the aforementioned three methods can take. Not only are each of the goods different from each other, and end up being put to superficially different uses, conveyed to various locations, they all seem to fulfill the same purpose, that being the continued operation of the Red Tower, the evasion of the truth of being. At this point, the question may come to you: why does the Red Tower produce anything at all? These goods seem so pointless and stupid. And you're absolutely right. Ligotti exaggerates the senseless and incomprehensible qualities of the products to cast our own analogous activities in a harsh light. Everything we do is groundless, pointless, and meaningless. It's all a lie we tell ourselves to avoid the truth of the nightmare. So in a way there is one point: to avoid the truth, or to further the Red Tower. Then why write The Last Messiah and The Red Tower and The Conspiracy Against the Human Race? Are Ligotti and Zapffe not guilty of these same things when they write their respective works? Ray Brassier, author of the fantastic book Nihil Unbound, writes in the foreword to The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, "Life, in Ligotti's outsized stamp of disapproval, is malignantly useless. No doubt critics will try to indict Ligotti of bad faith by claiming that the writing of this book is itself driven by the imperatives of the life that he seeks to excoriate. But the charge is trumped up, since Ligotti explicitly avows the impossibility for the living to successfully evade life's grip. This admission leaves the cogency of his diagnosis intact, for as Ligotti knows full well, if living is lying, then even telling the truth about life's lie will be a sublimated lie." All these strange and dark products reflect the inability to accept our paradoxical condition. Similarly with the Red Tower, its efforts of production and self-differentiation from the surrounding gray landscape are repeatedly likened to a betrayal, a refusal to resolve the paradoxical tension. Rather than accept that its difference is overwrought and perhaps succumb to the landscape, it leans into those differences and persists in them, exaggerating the paradox. The final phase of production necessitates an even further burrowing underground, meaning a further debasement. In this final chamber are gravestones, but not typical ones. These were not what might be called burying graves. This is to say that these were in no sense graves for burying the dead, quite the contrary. These were graves of a highly experimental design from which the newest productions of the Red Tower were to be born. These graves are birthing graves, an inextricable linking of the impulse to life and the inevitability of death. Spat out from these blasphemous natal pits are the hyperorganisms. This line of goods displayed the most essential qualities of their organic nature, which meant, of course, that they were wildly conflicted in their two basic features. On the one hand, they manifested an intense vitality in all aspects of their form and function. On the other hand, and simultaneously, they manifested an ineluctable element of decay in these same areas. To state this matter in the most lucid terms, each of these hyperorganisms, even as they scintillated with an obscene degree of vital impulses, also and at the same time had degeneracy and death written deeply upon them. Like their cradles, the birthing graves, these hyperorganisms exacerbate the tension of life and death to their utmost degree, full of life and destined for death, always growing, always decaying. It's another paradox of biological form. This final production phase could symbolize what Ligotti and Zapffe see as the most horrific response to the torture of reality, giving birth. When the last Messiah finally arrives in Zapfe's essay, his pronouncement is unambiguous. Know thyselves, be unfruitful, and let there be peace on earth after thy passing. Go extinct, for your reproduction only exacerbates the nightmare. Having a child, for various reasons, is seen by Ligotti and Zapffe as a complete refusal to acknowledge life's horror, a further betrayal. And rather than the more defensible methods outlined above, reproduction inherently perpetuates the nightmare of being to a higher degree by mandating that someone new will be subjected to it, someone just as likely to continue the cycle. Reproducing is the zenith of denial. The Red Tower births the hyperorganisms, which fully share the tower's paradoxical tension in their essential nature. They are biological, miniature instantiations of the Red Tower, and must necessarily and undeservedly face the consequences of the Red Tower's actions. Often I picture to myself what frantically clawing efforts these creations probably made to deliver themselves from that confining environment, which their malformed or non-existent brains could not begin to understand. They could not have comprehended any more than can I for what purpose they were bred from those graves, those incubators of hyperorganisms, minute factories of flesh that existed wholly within and far below the greater factory of the Red Tower. The hyperorganisms are confined, unable to understand why they are here. They claw and writhe and flail, unable to accept their fate which was forced upon them. Switching away from birth and reproduction, another way the hyperorganisms can be seen is as the manifestation of the fourth and final method of coping, sublimation. The fourth defense mechanism, sublimation, the mode of operation is transformation rather than suppression. With creative talent or unshakable panache, one might be able to transform the very agonies of life into pleasant experiences. One takes on the evils of life with a positive attitude, which can then twist them into useful experiences. Writers of tragedy are another example. To write a tragedy, one must first free oneself from, betray, the essence of tragedy, so that one can look at it in a calm, detached way, appreciating its aesthetic qualities. Sublimation, especially through the works of such authors as the existentialists, attempts to acknowledge and, as Zapffe just said, betray the tensions of life and produce something new out of it, just like the hyperorganisms, who are inherently tied to life and death, growth and decay. With the birthing graves, there is an acknowledgement of death that gives birth to something new. The hyperorganisms displayed the most essential qualities of their organic nature, just as sublimation attempts to transfigure and exaggerate the essences and contradictions of life into something vital and therapeutic. The Red Tower uses its contradictory nature to create something else. Are the hyperorganisms a representation of birth or of sublimation? I tend to see them as both, though I lean more towards birth because of the cradle and grave imagery, though reproduction itself can be seen as an act of sublimation with shades of attachment. Following the Red Tower's production of hyperorganisms, there is a final wave of destruction aimed at it from the landscape. The sublevel of manufacturing responsible for the disgusting hyperorganisms is destroyed, which to all appearances should have rendered the Red Tower finally inert. At first, one may see this as the last Messiah's pronouncement being carried out. The Red Tower, conscious life, paradoxical mankind, is finally extinct once the last and most potent method of coping, sublimation or birth through hyperorganisms, has been exposed as a mere lie. Its last gasp for breath is extinguished. The landscape has finally won. The paradox, the writhing wound on the otherwise bare surface of creation, has finally been healed. But the Red Tower is rumored to have survived this catastrophic blow. Nevertheless, there are indications that, appearances to the contrary, the factory continues to be active despite its status as a silent ruin. At this third level, these rumors maintain the factory's schedule of production is being carried out in some new and strange manner, representing its most ambitious venture in the output of putrid creations, ultimately consummating its tradition of degeneracy. How could this be? In The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, Ligotti, while acknowledging and seemingly supporting Zapffel's idea of extinction, is characteristically pessimistic about its likelihood. Humankind is and will always be unsuited to take charge of its own deliverance. The delusional will forever be with us, thereby making pain, fear, and denial of what is right in front of our face the preferred style of living, and the one that will be passed on to countless generations. Mankind cannot accept the truth of its being and look toward extinction. The Red Tower is stubborn and will persist, terminally incapable of accepting the one truly palatable solution. It will inevitably turn to some further and more profane line of production, and all one can do is be aware of it. People keep acting and distracting and talking, and without fail, everything they are saying is about the Red Tower, in one way or another, and about nothing else but the Red Tower. We are all talking and thinking about the Red Tower in our own degenerate way. Every utterance of mankind, no matter the apparent content or message, is a lie said in either truth or ignorance of the horror of being. Even the raving lunatics who dare speak of the Red Tower, presumably representing pessimists like Zapffe and Ligotti himself, still act in the tower's shadow. Everything we do is a mere deferral, a pushing back of the extinction that will likely never come, voluntarily at least. You cannot avoid revealing the Red Tower with your actions and speech, because it is the inevitable precondition for all action and all speech. The Red Tower is us, so everything from us is it. There ends my interpretation and analysis of the Red Tower. I'm pretty confident I am right in the broad strokes of the story. The biggest weakness with what I chose to explicitly interpret is probably the mapping of specific production phases to the coping methods from Zapffe. I definitely think there is something there that I picked up on, whether or not it was intentional, but some of the links, as I stated earlier, are tenuous. What I didn't end up commenting on much were the fadings and evaporations of the Red Tower. I likened them to failings of coping in my analysis, which I believe to be somewhat true, but there is still plenty of room for alternate ideas that I hope people will share in the comments. I also didn't touch on the hearsay quality much, save for at the very end where I identify these hallucinating mad people with nihilistic and pessimistic writers and philosophers, which makes a certain amount of sense, but I don't think it was founded enough on the text to include. Additionally, the narrator again and again professes a sick fascination with the Red Tower, and even acknowledges the cleverness and beauty in some of its creations. This could reflect Ligotti's belief that extinction won't happen, and his turn towards humanity, his obvious love of works of art, something like that, but I'm not exactly sure. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this reading and analysis of Ligotti's masterpiece, The Red Tower. As mentioned above, please support Ligotti with a purchase of his works if you enjoyed any part of this. I read The Red Tower in Teatro Grottesco, and obviously The Conspiracy Against the Human Race is a must-read for any Ligotti fan. My channel may also be worth a subscription. My content is pretty varied, but generally is focused on philosophy and dark fiction, and I always try to bring very high quality and rigorous scripts to my audience. If you like this exact topic, my last video goes through some cosmic horror recommendations that I think are worth reading over Lovecraft. Check that one out. Give the video a like, share your thoughts down below, and please have a nice day.